So, hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the CFO 4.0 podcast. I'm very pleased to announce that on today's podcast, we are going to talk about the topic of one-to-ones and mentoring. And in order to do so, I've brought on a fabulous guest. So, Susana Serrano-Davey, who I am reliably informed is the only Susana Serrano-Davey around. So Susana is a CFO mentor, and she does this for a number of organizations. But rather than me tell everybody about the work that you do, Susana, it would be lovely for you to do a bit of an intro. So tell us about yourself and how you ended up as a CFO mentor.
Oh, hello, Hannah. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, and I hope that people that are listening enjoy it and get a lot out of it. About myself, well, I'm originally Spanish, born and bred Spanish until the age of 21, whereupon I fell in love with an Englishman, and that took me to England. And in England, I went to university, I did my degree, had a family, and built my career as many of us do in finance, working initially in practice. I qualified with PwC, and then I worked for another firm, and eventually I moved into industry, large blue chip companies, large organizations like TUI and then Aegis. I had my own business along the way, which I built and sold. And 3 years ago, life gave me one of these massive pushes because I had a health problem, and I thought, one of these self-realization moments in your life. And I realized that whilst I'd really enjoyed my career and I had achieved everything I set out to achieve, I was ready for something different. So I jumped off that cliff, leaving my corporate job, not really knowing what I was going to do. That was one of the bravest things I've done, actually, trying to let go of that label we all worked so hard to build, that CFO, professional woman. We worked hard for that, don't we? I let go of that, and 3 years on, I have written and published a book, a professional development book for people in the workplace. I'm told that is very useful. I also have become a mentor, a professional mentor. And if you had told me 3 years ago that I was going to be doing that, I would have said, but how? How can I do the transition from being a CFO, busy corporate jungle, to sharing my experience in such a wonderful way?
Oh no, and I think what's lovely is that you've got the mix of skills coming through. So I think it's always sometimes hard for those who haven't been in the finance arena to understand some of the finance concepts, and it can be quite scary. But actually, you've taken that and you've added on that leadership development piece, which is really exciting. And when we were talking about topics for today's podcast, the one that you thought would be particularly valuable is the concept of one-to-ones and mentoring. So tell us why you picked that topic and why it's so important. Let's start with the why.
Why? Because it crops up a lot in my conversations when I mentor people. And just to give you a simple example, only a few weeks ago, one of my mentees, lovely lady, she's in finance, and she was telling me about a challenge she had with one of her direct reports. Not complaining about it, but somehow there was a little bit of complaint. And then as we pull the thread, as I like to call it, as we continue with the conversation, she realized that she was behaving in the same way with her own line manager. And that came with a sort of pop moment of, right, I need to change my approach. Yeah. And she wrote to me only 2 hours after our session, and she said, Susana, I can't tell you how impactful our conversation was, because I've already changed how I'm going to approach my one-to-ones with my line manager. So to me, acknowledging that we don't always behave as we think we behave, and acknowledging what are the areas that strengthen your positioning with your superiors, and perhaps the things that weaken them, it can be really empowering, because you change the chip, you change behaviors, and therefore you're not only more impactful, but people see you as a more powerful and someone with potential rather than someone that needs constant support. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's very much from the perspective, perhaps, of a senior finance controller or somebody that has got that up the chain piece. And I can see that also being valuable for a CFO. But what about on the other side? So why is it important to have a good one-to-one and mentoring relationship with your direct report? So on the other side, for CFOs that are listening to this,
Yes.
that feel they're having some challenges running the one-to-ones and mentoring sessions.
I think the relationship between the team member and the line manager is one of these things that when it works, it really benefits both sides. So whether you happen to be sitting on the line manager chair or the subordinate chair, is going to add value. So for the CFO, if you take care in nurturing the relationship with your direct reports, you're going to have people who are more motivated, people who are actually going to be able to delegate things properly with, and you're going to grow yourself as a person as well. Because to me, when I mentor people, I grow, I learn. And sometimes, unfortunately, when we're in the busy office, we forget to make time for that piece, and we're constantly working on the to-do list. And whilst that to-do list is important, it's missing out like the icing on the cake. And so I certainly have tried throughout the years to not forget that personal side of my relationship with the people I've worked with. And my argument is that if we do it well, albeit sometimes challenging from a time point of view, is pretty magical, really.
And I think we could all use a bit of magic when it comes to
We can.
our
Why not? I mean,
relationships.
one of the things, I agree. We need to get rid of those stereotypes. Accountants think of ourselves, and other people think of ourselves as very serious people, very grey people, and we're not that. We are who we are, and we can choose how to behave. And so just because we happen to be the serious CFO doesn't mean you can't have a softer side that you use to your benefit and also the benefit of the people working with you.
Absolutely. And I guess let's just start with a bit of self-awareness, a bit of a self-check.
Yes.
How do you, what are some of the signs that one-to-one process isn't working and that mentor? What are some of the things that somebody can look for and go, yeah, this is definitely a podcast I need to spend some time listening to? Let's start there.
I think there is several things you could probably look out for. But if I was to pick one, the one thing would be, is there a sense of frustration when you walk out of your one-to-one? If you're a line manager and you walk out of a one-to-one with your direct report and you feel, oh, they're just not doing what I need them to do, or they're just not listening, or they're just not delivering, then you're not doing what you can do. And if you are actually on the direct report side, if you leave the room thinking, I wish they helped me in a way I haven't been able to express, or there is something unsaid, then you're not doing the right thing. Is that a
Brilliant.
simple enough test for you, Hannah?
I think that's a great test. And I always think it's good to understand the signs that things aren't working. Because like you said with that first example, sometimes a lack of awareness, if you're not aware, what was the terminology? Unconscious incompetence, I think is the term. If you're not aware there's a problem,
Yes.
then you don't know to fix it. So let's assume we've moved past the unconscious incompetence piece and we're in the we're consciously incompetent. So let's start with what should we think of? What's the first thing we need to consider when thinking about how we structure our one-to-ones?
First of all, one-to-ones, I think, it's almost like the nest, the beginning of nurturing that relationship. So I think we need to, on one hand, acknowledge that it's not just the one-to-one. It's one of the elements that you use to build and strengthen the relationship you have with each other. And so I think it's important to make sure they happen. I mean, how many of you listening can really say to yourself, I have time with all my direct reports regularly? And how many of you can say, I have sufficient access to my line manager? If the answer is you don't have that time, then make sure you find it. I had the example, just to give you an anecdote, a line manager I had years ago. I didn't have a one-to-one with her in the first 3 months in my role. She was too busy. And we ended up with a terrible relationship that ended up in tears, literally, because she hadn't made time for me, and I hadn't been assertive enough to say, look, I need time to do my job well. I need your guidance. So first of all, make sure they happen, because I think sometimes they don't happen, or they don't happen sufficiently enough. And secondly, once you have them, make sure you make the most of them. So make sure you go into the room prepared. We often go into a one-to-one sort of in a whirlwind. What's the point in that? If you went to a serious normal meeting, you would have an agenda, you would have an idea of the topics you want to cover. Why can't we do that as well for one-to-ones? Make sure, for instance, that it's clear the topics we talk to each other about, that it's clear who needs to do what next afterwards, rather than leave topics in the air. So almost, it might sound terrible, almost treat it like a little project plan. You have a number of topics to address, you address them, and everybody walks away knowing what's next. That would be good practice in any kind of meeting. And then I would bring onto the table elements that are more personal. Perhaps forget the to-do list is important, as I said, but I think there is the mentoring side and the personal side comes from really making sure you listen to each other and taking time to try and watch the situation from the other's perspective. So not just concentrating on that to-do list, but making time to listen, to observe. Is this person, do they feel comfortable? Do they feel flustered? These things, they may sound obvious, but quite often we don't pay any attention. We just go for the jugular. We're like, whip, whip, whip. And we ignore all the signs that go with whether somebody is at ease, somebody is satisfied, somebody is enjoying the conversation. You and I are enjoying our conversation. I certainly am. So why should one-to-ones be different? Just because we also have a job to-do list to cover.
I think that's they shouldn't be a scary or there should be something that either of you dread. Like, I think that's one of the things. Sometimes people are worried about, not even dread is probably the wrong word, but I think that has sometimes happened.
Yeah, I know what you mean. You're a bit apprehensive.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting. I would say a lot of the dread or the worry comes from a lack of understanding of how to do it, worrying that you're not going to do it well. And you talked about the importance of an agenda. So what are the sorts of things that you would say should always be on the agenda? Kind of how do you structure that conversation? If, when you do one-to-ones, is it the same every time? Are there similar themes that you always bring up? Or
no,
do you have
I think
different agenda?
It depends. It depends on what's happening. But some good practices, for instance, would be, I always used to keep a note of, instead of bombarding each other with little questions all the time, things that can wait, you just make a list of things you want to talk to each other about, because sometimes it's going to be much faster to deal with them in person than to send each other 30 emails. And as well as faster, it's more, it's nicer to engage in a conversation rather than having this unilateral. So make a list of all those little things that can wait until you see each other for your start. But the other thing is, if you have any difficult conversations, and I would bring onto the table that topic now, quite often we shy away from the difficult conversations, both as a line manager and as a direct report. And that's the piece you can prepare best. So you actually use your one-to-one to discuss any areas that are creating friction, anything that makes you uncomfortable, anything that you need from each other. That's the platform to have that conversation. And the way to prepare, in my case, would always, and it's always still the case, I even do it for my personal life, I just make a list of what are my key messages, what are the things in a succinct way, what are the things I need from the other person, and how can I help them? And then through having that plan, it means that you don't leave the room having left important things unsaid. Because how often and then I ask you and people who might be listening, you've walked into a meeting with the intention to discuss something important, and then you may have done it, but then you've left really important things out of the table. And when you walk out, you think, I wish I said this and I wish I said that. And perhaps you've sort of gone on and on about things that weren't important. So prepare the difficult ideas, the ideas about the difficult conversations in advance, in writing. The other thing I'd say to have good one-to-ones is agree with the other person. Let them know you want to talk about that particular topic, because they also need to think about it and prepare.
Yes, I learned that early on in my team leader days, is that certain individuals don't like to be surprised with a topic. So
they don't.
Giving them the heads up is a really good first step as a manager.
So you can always tell each other, oh, by the way, when we meet, I want to talk about this in particular, if it's something unusual. So you warn the other person that you want to talk about that. And also make them, as you mentioned earlier, they don't need to be super formal. I would enjoy with my direct reports to occasionally have a one-to-one out of the office, having a coffee or having lunch, or so that you make room to talk about perhaps professional development, to find out how they are, to talk about the things you don't always talk about when you're busy looking at that to-do list and trying to keep the deadlines and filing everything at month end. And it's just tough when you're in finance to make time for those elements that I believe are really important.
No, absolutely. And I think sometimes picking your time of the month, if you're going to put it in on the second or third day of the month, you've picked the wrong day, haven't you? Let's be very honest. So pick your time to do that. And sometimes it can be hard, can't it? When everyone's absolutely crazy busy, to find the time. And we talk about CFOs prioritizing time as the person that's doing the one-to-one and the mentoring. What if your direct report is struggling to find the time and not able to engage? How would you approach that?
Well, I think we need to always lead by example. So if you're making time for your direct reports, I would be very surprised if a direct report is not going to make time for you. And also it depends I would normally have short catch-ups with my direct reports. If you have too many, even once every 2 weeks, half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, they don't need to be every week. So that's another important point to think. It's better to have fewer one-to-ones that are good one-to-ones, that have too many that are just almost like going through the motions and doing what we're supposed to do. So if you as a leader make those interactions important in your own agenda, you share that with the team. And if they don't make time for you, say, look, I really think it's important. In my experience, when I haven't looked after relationships through one-to-one, those are the relationships that have ended with more friction, I don't mean ended as in finishing, but you end up having more misunderstandings with clients, or it's important. You cannot, and especially nowadays, I was supporting a project last year with an entrepreneur, and I was mentoring him, but I was also doing a little bit of mentoring for the finance director in the company. And he didn't have time for me. He was always in New York. And I said to him over and over again, I can't do my job without talking to you. I need access to you. And nowadays that we have a Slack and we have all these 100,000 channels, that our communication has become busy noise, but not real communication. That I can look at you here. I can see your face. I can see you're listening to me. You can't do that on Slack.
No, and you can't read context on Slack. And I think that's one of the pieces that we talk about, the importance of communication. And I'm a big believer that there's real value in the amount of tools that we have and ways to communicate in that. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's something about not only teams, but also, like you say, meeting in person, having a coffee, changing the environment to get that headspace. I'm a big personal fan of, I love a walking meeting. So I always feel that helps, and is a really good way to to have some great conversations. And some of the most impactful conversations that I feel like I've had have been when we're walking. We've talked a lot about obviously structuring. We talked about the importance of making time and structuring a meeting. What else do you think is important to think about for a successful one-to-one and relationship?
I think one of the things I talk about in my book is balancing the balance of power in the relationship between that line manager and direct report, because we don't often realize how unbalanced that is. It depends a little bit, I think, on your personality style, but it's not uncommon for when you're reporting to someone, somehow you take a step back. You feel accountable for everything, but you don't make the other side accountable. So first of all, acknowledging that it's a relationship that has two sides and they both have an input into that relationship. So it shouldn't all be that stewardship towards your line manager. Your line manager also has a responsibility towards you to help you and enable you to do your job well. The other thing in that is that things like finding your voice, you can't, sometimes we can be a little bit overly shy to express our opinion in front of our line manager. I would ask our listeners to just observe themselves for a few days and think, am I behaving differently with my line manager than I am with my direct reports or than I am with my peers? Because quite often the answer to that question, I always like to work with questions when I do mentoring, is quite often is, no, I'm not behaving. I'll ask you, Hannah, now, if you take a moment to think, do you behave in the same neutral way with those three peer groups, the line manager, subordinates and peers?
I would say, yes, I do. There was probably some I say peers and direct reports. I feel like that is a very similar relationship, but when, I'm quite an outspoken individual. So I would say I'm probably similar across all three, but I can understand where there's some differences there.
So I think understanding that needs to be balanced, they both have a part to put in, that you need to find a way to express your opinions well with your line manager or with your subordinates as well. Sometimes we are the opposite. We don't want to offend, or we're too careful with that. We wrap our direct reporting in cotton wool. That's not good either. So it's finding the balance and not perhaps waiting to leave the room to express your frustrations. Quite often I have worked, like many of us, in places that people would walk into a room, into a meeting, something will be said, they won't say a thing, and then as soon as they walk out, they'll start spreading this terrible complaint around the office, and you think, what's the point in that? Not only you're damaging the culture, but you're not actually taking your place in that relationship to make not your demand, but to express your position and request the help that you need.
And that's a really interesting point, because I think that can be a more common scenario than people think. And it can either be blatant or it can be really subtle. So where you feel like a relationship has gone wrong, perhaps you haven't done good one-to-ones previously. How do you deal with that situation when people are discussing outside of your one-to-ones or the challenges, but don't bring it forwards? How would you manage that scenario?
My personal approach has always been to talk. I think is there a talk slogan somewhere say it's good to talk, or is it Tesco? There's a slogan out there that I remember in England that it says it's good to talk, or is it BT? It's probably BT.
So yeah, I was going to say, I think BT.
If it's if one of my team members I know is not being forthcoming to me, I will meet them and say, I know we've had this topic on the table. I hear, or I understand that you have some thoughts about it. Can we talk about it? Because when you see in front of each other and you try and cover a particular topic, not in a confrontational way, but what pain is it causing you? what pain is it causing me? What challenges do you have? What challenges do I have? Through that conversation, there is always, the least that can happen is that you take the heat level down. And the most probable thing is that you will find a common way forward. So I would always bring it up. I remember one, and I would do that with any circumstance. Even I remember one time with one of my team members that she was quite rude about a person in another department, allegedly. I didn't hear it, but these things happen in the office, right? And the other person took a lot of offense. So I had a one-to-one with and she wasn't even my direct report. She was the next level down. But I sat down and I said, "Look, I want to talk to you about an incident that I believe that has happened." And we just had a nice chat. And in the end, she was mortified. Yes, she had done it, but because I didn't go there to admonish her, I just said, "What happened? I hear that this has happened. This person is really upset. Do you really think it's appropriate behavior?" And it was fine. She didn't do it again. And I understand she even spoke to this person and apologized. Whereas if you leave these things unsaid and loose in the office, I think they get out of hand, whether it happens to be an unvented frustration or it happens to be somebody's behavior that hasn't been appropriate. We need to talk. It's good to talk, Hannah.
We need to find the time to talk more, I think, is always the piece. And obviously, one-to-ones are a lot easier when you've had time with that person and you've built it step by step. How would you, if you were new into role, you've got a new set of direct reports, how would you start that? Because very often people come into a new role, they've got a big plans and a big agenda that they're looking to deliver or they're expected to deliver.
Yes.
So how do you balance the need to have time to build those relationships with the need to get things moving and to start showing the impact?
The premise, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that we need to recognize that having that time is part of the job. Because what you just said implies that it's almost like a luxury. You've got a transformation program to deliver. You need to close on time. You need to turn the business around and make profit. But without a functioning team, you can't do that. And the only way you're going to be able to deploy others on your behalf to do a good job is that if you have good relationships. And that goes not only for your direct reports, but also for people outside of the department, the rest of the key stakeholders. So to me, many years ago, in fact, it was in a women and leadership program that I was lucky enough to do when I was at Dentsu. One of the biggest learning points from that program was to realize that relationships were not a nice thing to have, Hannah. They were the key to unlocking my potential and unlocking my ability to drive change in my organization. And from then on, I started to have more one-to-ones, not just with people in my team, and to make that part of the job. So in answer to your question now, when you take on a new team, that's the first thing you need to do. Make time for the relationships. Personally, that's what I have done and what I recommend my mentees. When you start in a new organization, you need to have a plan and a map of who are your key stakeholders. And that involves your direct reports. It involves senior stakeholders in the other departments. Perhaps if you're the CFO, it could be the commercial director or the legal director or whoever they are. And you go around like a lovely politician doing the campaign and meeting them all on a one-to-one basis. And I reiterate my point. That's not a nice thing to have. That is the key to you having success in that organization.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I think finding the time is absolutely critical, especially. And I think when we talked about like having success in your first 90 days as a CFO, building relationships all over the organization is absolutely a part of that. And I think I was talking to Kevin about that actually. But I guess those relationships take time to mature, right? Mm-hmm. So when you have that transformation plan to deliver, but you've got to deploy it within the next 90 days, or at least start those conversations. How do you balance, or how would you balance wanting to build a relationship and having And obviously having the time in the diary, if you've got those one-to-ones, how do you balance the content of those one-to-ones so that you're able to start the cogs turning in those conversations about this is where I need you to be, but also building that relationship in a way that isn't, all about what you want, but also about what the individual needs?
Yes, I think in transformation programs, and when you have a lot to deliver, the best way to go about that is doing the one-to-ones, not all of them, but certainly the ones that have to do with that project, with that transformation, to have them as a group. So yourself and your key direct reports, or even someone from outside another department that is heavily involved in that, and run it almost as a working group. Because, and that I'm talking about a working group that starts to create the plan together and then agrees on what needs to be done, when, and by whom, and then doing the follow-up as time goes by. And and effectively, I think your role as a CFO is to facilitate that working group. And if you do that, if you work as a group, I think it's a much more effective and faster way than individually dealing with each of the people. Because ultimately, as a leader, you are a facilitator. That's what you are. You're not supposed to do anything yourself. So your ability to deploy people together, then we're talking. We can do a lot of things fast.
That's a really great tip. So having a lot of those conversations as a group versus as individuals. And would you change the agenda of your one-to-ones? As like if you think about your first one-to-one with somebody, is there certain things that you make sure are on that initial agenda? And does that differ from somebody perhaps you've been working with for a few months now?
The first one-to-one, I think, is the opportunity to introduce yourself properly to the other person in private, because you haven't always had the opportunity to do that. And I think the best thing you can do is to ask about their pain points, is to understand how does finance or someone else in the team or your position, how can you make their life better? And if you listen to those pain points, not only will you find your roadmap opportunities for the future, but you will immediately build rapport with the other person. So I think that first one-to-one should be about them, not about you, once you've introduced yourself properly.
I love that. And I think that's a great suggestion. And then, we've talked a bit about, obviously, we've kind of touched on the topic of having difficult conversations, but that comes up, like you said, more often than not, and it's always difficult to do. Have you got any top tips for somebody that knows they're going into a difficult conversation, or perhaps has got some performance issues with an individual? How would you approach that?
Yes, I have. I have a whole chapter in a book about difficult conversations, and I have videos on my blog. So I have a lot to say about difficult conversations. I think the first step has to be, in my opinion, to step back. Quite often, when we're in a difficult situation, just talking to you about it, I can sense my emotion in here in the tummy. And that's the first thing we need to neutralize. So before even thinking about the topic, you need to recognize that we have an emotional response to that. And we need to get past that if we are to see and resolve the conflict in the right way. Because at the beginning, we're usually sort of in this muddle of either anger or frustration or whatever it is, and we're going around. If you get stuck in that cycle, you're not going to be able to do anything about it. So you better recognize that you need to get out of that. So once you step back and become more of a normal person rather than an enraged, crazy woman, you can think about, okay, let's think about this in a calm and neutral way. What's the conflict about? What is creating a problem for me within that situation? What is the need of the other person that is forcing that conflict? And when you start to unpick the situation, you often find that the conflict is not, it's not personal, shouldn't be personal. It's normally because you need something different to what I need, and there is a clash of needs that lead to that conflict. And therefore, when you have them, you think, okay, if you need that and I need this, how do we come together? And then thinking about what can I do to help you? And also thinking about what do I need from you before addressing the conflict in person with a conversation. So once you have this much clearer picture of what's going on and acknowledging that it's just a set of two individuals or two departments with two different needs, that you can find a common way forward, that you can have the conversation. I think the third step then would be to warn the other person that you want to talk to them about it. Say, hey, Hannah, I've been thinking about this heated discussion that we had. Can we meet again and talk about it to find a way forward? So you warn them so they can prepare. And then you meet them, and you meet them not in front of a table when you're across me, but meet them perhaps having a coffee or out of in nobody's territory, and say, hey, how can I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm sorry if my needs are clashing with your needs. How shall we resolve this? And I have had wonderful experiences with difficult conversations that I felt were nearly unsurmountable. And I have walked away feeling not only empowered because I've been able to at least discuss them, but also with a warm heart, because I have walked out of that conversation seeing the other person as a better individual, as an ally rather than an enemy, because we've been able to talk to each other in a constructive way.
And so what are some of the mistakes? Because we talked about how to do it well. We've said, firstly,
Yes.
giving a person the heads up, trying to do it outside of perhaps your normal working space or in a less formal environment, and spend the time certainly up front understanding the other person's viewpoint. So what are some of the common mistakes? Like, what are the kind of the things to watch out for that you've seen go wrong with those kind of conversations?
I think the first mistake is just dropping bombshells without realizing. We've all done that at some point. And I remember once one of my most terrible experiences of feedback from a line manager was that this one I told you that I hadn't met for weeks. I didn't have a one-to-one. And then we met on a leaving do. We both had a glass of wine in front of us. So by the way, don't take my suggestion to have it somewhere informal as somebody's leaving do with a glass of wine in the hand. And we just came across each other, and she just took the opportunity to tell me lots of things, some of them good, I'm sure, but some of them bad. And I just took like this massive bombshell that caught me by surprise. So be aware that everything we say to somebody we work with can be taken as feedback, because it is feedback. So the first mistake is be very sensitive. Don't just drop bombshells and make statements in the wrong context without warning, because it can really create a lot of havoc. And I think if I went to look for that one thing to look out for, just be careful with the things you say, because sometimes they can land like a massive bombshell. I have seen in Slack channels, I have worked with somebody not that long ago that would just write things in the Slack channel like, this is unacceptable, you're doing your job wrong, and they're doing that in public. And can you really think that nobody around you in your organization does things like that? Because I think it happens rather more than it should happen. So just bite your lip and wait for the right moment to pass judgment on somebody's behavior or somebody's work.
Yeah, I am the worst person for this. I'm quite I just want to, do it and do something and do it now. And those that know me will know exactly what I'm talking about. But I had some good advice from an individual saying timing is everything. And finding
Absolutely.
the right moment to have the conversation is incredibly important.
Yes. And we don't realize when we drop things because we don't have time, as you just said, you just want to get it over and done with. I certainly would never deal with difficult conversations in writing, never ever. I think just switch off your Slack, switch off your email. It's something you need to do in person. And we forget, because a written conversation is a one-way channel.
And it can be misread. So context and discussion is so important when with feedback.
And of course, for us accountants, I think we're so used to the black and white of the numbers that sometimes we can be very factual. And actually, once you leave the numbers aside, there is nothing factual. Everything is grey. There's no black and white. Everything is shades of grey.
And that's, I guess, that's the hard bit of stepping out of that sort of financial role and into a leadership role is getting comfortable with the grey areas that appear. So one of the key challenges is that, you know, and I've had this feedback, a lot of our listeners are going through some kind of change. So there is something happening within the workplace, whether that's, you know, we all know that AI is going to change finance and have a massive impacts on over the next few years in terms of how we work, but also there's often structural or technological or process changes that need to be made within an organization. So as a mentor and as a leader, how can I use those one-to-ones to support the individual, particularly where that person is going to be impacted, whether that, you know, whether they know they're going to be impacted or not at that point? How do you have conversations that help them through that change and that transformation?
I have been in that situation a number of times, Hannah, with my team, when we have been embedding lots of change. And the first reaction humans have, even ourselves, even me, however much I like change, the first reaction is always resistance. And therefore, I think what we can do to support our people is to acknowledge that that's a natural reaction. And we can get through that rather than label the person as somebody who is just against change. I remember a lady years ago in my early days at TUI that she was like so grumpy, lovely, just so lovely. And but she was known for not wanting any change whatsoever. But then over time, as we implemented the things that we had to do, in the end, she was one of my biggest allies for change. Because instead of, and I think sometimes we do that, we label people as they're against change. So we almost like put them in the back room and we ignore them, and we work with the people that we think they have the change appetite. But actually, we need to bring everyone into the change journey. So acknowledging that is natural for people to be initially resistant and bring them on the journey. And I think there are probably many ways to do that. But for me, what has been effective is to tell them what it is that is happening. Also make them involved where possible on some of the decisions, because it's very easy to point the finger at, or point the fault at things that you don't have any input over. But once you have the opportunity to be involved in the conversation, you realize that there is no perfect outcome, and therefore you become a supporter. So for instance, I'm a great believer, I've done it a few times, of involving in the direct reports in the recruitment of the new line manager. I had to recruit when I was CFO, I had to recruit a new FD, and the FD that was leaving had been in the company for 25 years. He was loved. So replacing him was going to be really difficult, and it was going to be even harder for the team to accept the new team member. So what did I do? I got them involved in the interview process. And of course, they realized that there is no such thing as a perfect candidate. They all had a voice about what they liked most and least of the different candidates. And in the end, when I took their input into the decision, this person joined, and they were already relaxed because it wasn't so scary anymore to have a new boss. And B, they were supporting him because they had been part of choosing them. So I think engaging the difficult people, allegedly, or people that find the change difficult in the process is a very wise strategy to get them on board and move forward.
So this has been a fabulous conversation, Susanna. I've genuinely enjoyed it, but at some point we have to finish, right? So
We do.
let me ask you. So, your final top tips for, as a finance leader or a CFO, what are your top tips for having fabulous one-to-one and mentoring conversations?
Well, Hannah, thank you. Top tips. You're great and you're worth it. So make sure that when you go into your relationships, of whichever direction they are, you make yourself justice by finding your voice, by being able to articulate your needs, and being able to not only demand but also provide. And also making sure that you realize that behind that conversation there is a relationship, and relationships need nurturing, they need taking care of, and when these relationships work well, they will accompany you not only through that transformation program that you are wanting to implement, but through your career and beyond. So make sure you take time to listen to each other, to have proper one-to-ones in person, that you are sensitive about how does it feel for the other person, and just bring your human side. Forget a little bit about your serious accountant that has to deliver the numbers. Just go back to the soft person that, think of your dog and what emotion that brings in you. You mustn't leave that person at home. You must take it to work, because that is the person that will help you gel and make sure people that work with you care about you and care about the work you do together.
Wonderful. And that's a lovely note on which to finish the podcast. So thank you so much, Susanna, for joining me today. If our listeners want to learn more about yourself and the services you offer, where is the best place to find you? Where can they learn more?
The easiest thing is to Google my name, Susana Serrano-Davey, because I am the only one. But I also have a website, which is serranodavey.com. And there's lots of material. I love sharing some of my insights, and that doesn't mean I'm always right. But if I have made you or our listeners think again about certain things today, then I'm achieving my purpose.
Amazing. And thank you for sharing that. For anyone that is interested, I will add those links to the show notes and in the podcast. And of course, if there is a question I should have asked, perhaps there's a follow-up question you have for Susanna, and an excuse for me to get her back on the podcast, then please do reach out. You know where I am, guys. Please ask the question. And thank you again, Susanna. It was amazing having you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Hannah. I really enjoyed it too.